Hello and good afternoon from Hyde Park. My name is Chris Sweet. I am Executive Director of the Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy in the State at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And we're very excited today to be hosting a conversation with Professor J.S. Nelson on her book, Business Ethics, What Everyone Needs to Know, co-authored with the late Lynn A. Stout. Professor Nelson will be speaking with Chicago Booth's John Paul Rollert. Before we begin, please note that we are on the record and we will also post this event to our YouTube channel. We invite your questions, so we may hold them until the end. You see the Q&A icon at the bottom. Feel free to provide any questions you have there. And as usual, views expressed by our guests are their own. They are not the views of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. This is a busy week at the Stigler Center. Our next webinar is actually going to be on Wednesday, March 8th. And will be hosted by our digital publication, Pro Market. That conversation is entitled, What's Old is New Again, Industrial Policies Revival. It'll be a conversation on the reemergence of industrial policy in the US, the EU, and other parts of the world. So please check out our website for more details. There you can also check out promarket.org and subscribe to our Capitalism podcast. You'll find all of the links to those in our chat function at the bottom of your screen. You know, often at business schools, how we interrogate decisions of firms and managers is through a pretty narrow lens. We think about, does this generate enough profits? Is this a big enough opportunity for growth? But when we interrogate how decisions impact ourselves and society as a whole, our analysis and thinking can get a little fuzzy. But from corporate scandals to rethinking how we invest, these decisions are in front of business leaders every day. It's part of the reason we're so excited to host today's conversation. Now let me introduce our panelists. J.S. Nelson is a professor of law at Villanova University. In this current academic year, she is also a visiting researcher with the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School. Professor Nelson's work explores the intersection of corporate law, white-collar crime, and business ethics. She concentrates on the way that legal rules shape ethical behavior within business organizations and the impact of different frameworks on large-scale corporate wrongdoing. Our moderator today is John Paul Rollert, Adjunct Associate Professor of Behavioral Science here at Chicago Booth. He is also the in-house ethicist for the Chicago Booth Review. His teaching and research focuses on the intellectual history of capitalism, the ethics of leadership, and the application of empathy to law, business, and politics. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to JS.
All right, I'll start sharing. So the plan was that I would talk to you for a few minutes, about 20 minutes maximum, about this book that is out with the Oxford University Press and that I hope that you really enjoy. It's written for you. It's supposed to be very accessible. It's taking a very important subject and breaking it down into manageable questions. The actual book is short questions and answers. So even though, you know, John Paul gave me grief that it's over 500 pages, the back is really notes and supporting data so that you have that should you need it. Otherwise, it's a very it's supposed to be a very accessible book. As John Paul and I were talking, we realized that there's so much going on in the book that it would really help perhaps to target and focus some takeaways from the book. So I'll talk about that for a few minutes, and John Paul and I will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we would love your questions. So please start putting the questions in the chat. I'm flagging that for you far ahead of time. So when we're thinking about these issues, we have to talk about company culture. And when we think about culture, we're often thinking about the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institutional organization. But there's another definition of culture, which is to grow in a prepared medium. And I want to flag that for you because it's this other definition of culture that should really get our attention and make it very clear that this is something that we have to pay attention to. So when we're thinking of ethics, we have to be thinking of it as a garden. It will be growing something. So Would you like your ethical culture to look like this? Or are we thinking about a neglected ethical culture that looks more like this? And when we're thinking about management, and I'm flagging this specifically for the students out there, but also for the professionals, this is the process of dealing with or controlling things or people. What's that mean? It means to align people within an organization and bind them to pursue the organization's purpose. So you must pay attention to culture. You must pay attention to the things that are growing in your garden, because it will influence your ability to actually lead your organization. And management is about people and how to get the best of them. So dealing with organizational culture, dealing with business ethics is core to management. If you don't manage these issues, they get out of control and you can't run your organization, which is a very important insight. So it's just as important as your balance sheet to know what your company culture is, to think about business ethics and make sure that you're having those conversations and managing this part of your organization. Thinking about the landscape, we often have people who say, well, you know, how big an issue is this? And it's very interesting because the issue is very much like a garden. It can grow in all kinds of different ways. And we know that by and large, people want to be ethical. It is much easier to manage people in an ethical way. You get their natural impulses and instincts on your side. And we know that there's a certain percentage of the population that will behave unethically no matter what. That seems to be fairly fixed. We have a series of studies on it, and we have a large proportion of the population where the ethics are not fixed and are very malleable. But by and large want to be predominantly ethical. And then we have a very small percentage of the population, and I can give you some basic numbers as we go through this, that is very rigid and they're going to do the ethical thing no matter what. So you don't need to worry about managing them, but you really need to worry about managing the large percentage of the population in the middle. And there's a certain number of people who are going to cheat no matter what. It's about 7 to 8%. It's the same percentage each year as cheat in online gaming systems, as commit MBA admissions fraud. It's the same number of people. It's a very small group of people. And what you have to worry about is that there's contagion from that small group of people influencing the rest of your organization. And you really are in a battle for the hearts and minds of the rest of the organization. But remember that most people will instinctually want to help you, want to act ethically. It's very dramatic. Employees, by and large, penalize companies for unethical behavior. So if they believe that a company is unethical, they're far less likely to accept a job offer. And when there's a tight labor market, that's something to think about. This number, 77%, has been unchanged through difficult economic times. Then you need to think about the fact that you're going to have to give a pay increase for people to work at an unethical company. People don't like working at unethical companies. So it'll cost you about a 57% premium in pay. That is very significant. It's more expensive to be on an unethical company. Then you're more likely to lose your people if you're an unethical company. In fact, 92% of employees say that they would be willing to jump ship for a company with an ethical reputation, and by the way, take less money for it. So that is really setting yourself up to be vulnerable if you're not thinking about ethics and you're not managing ethics within your organization. Finally, in just bottom line terms, it's expensive not to be ethical. It's expensive in annual employee turnover costs, which are 1.5 to 5 times annual salary to replace, but it's also expensive in other ways. I want to point out that the very basis of the word credit in English is the Latin word for trust, to believe, right? And the terms on which you do business and that you are extended credit change depending on your reputation and whether people think that they can trust you, whether you're an ethical company and you have a reputation as an ethical company. So it literally goes to your bottom line. I put 2 slides in here, which I thought you guys might find interesting. The effects, these ethical predisposition effects and rewards for ethical behavior from companies are really strong among millennials and Generation Z, but they look a little different. So here's a slide on millennials. They will pay significantly more for ethically sourced products. In fact, 75% will pay significant premiums for ethically sourced products. The reason why there's a bunch of photos of the coffee plant in the corner is most of these were done off the coffee studies where they asked people how much more they would pay for an ethically sourced cup of coffee, but it's been shown in all kinds of other studies. These are about the right numbers in study after study. So, and we have a significant punishment for on behalf of millennials specifically for companies that engage in unethical behavior. So they want about a 30% discount on your product if they're going to buy something that they don't feel it has a good reputation in the marketplace. And that's a significant headwind to be able to overcome if you're working in a marketplace. You have to sell your product for 30% less than your competitors, even to have customers look at you. Finally, and this is an interesting point, that the millennial demographic effects here are actually larger in the developing world. And the hypothesis has been that it's because in the developing world, they more directly see the impact of poor ethical behavior. And in those areas, the developing world where many of your customers are and a lot of wealth is being generated, it's 23 to 29% want to see who are willing to pay premiums for ethically sourced products in those developing countries. Generation Z, let's talk about that briefly. Generation Z is expected to make up 30% of the US workforce by 2030. It currently has purchasing power that's really grabbing companies' attention. It's currently 143 billion, but it's going to grow very fast. They very strongly expect brands to contribute to society, so 68%. They're willing to pay more for products that are produced and ethically and sustainably. But this is a big difference from millennials. Specifically on this point, Generation Z feel very positively toward brands that promote gender equity on social media. That's an eye-popping number, 77%. So there are other pieces of your ethical profile to be aware of. And specifically when you're thinking about Generation Z, you need to think about gender equity as part of your ethical reputation and profile. So I pulled a chart for you, thinking about millennials, Generation Z, and COVID kids. It's more than half the population now, significantly, and growing, right? The central problem in ethics is simultaneously intuitive and counterintuitive, because all this stuff sounds fairly straightforward. Okay, there's a business case for acting ethically and being a responsible company. There's vast agreement on what people should do. We actually don't have that many debates over what the ethical thing is to do in a situation. And we don't have that many debates about basic values around the world. It's amazingly similar. The real problem is why people don't do it. This is the fundamental issue. Why is it that we don't see this ethical behavior everywhere if it's such a competitive advantage? And there's some big takeaways about designing ethical behavior and designing an ethical company and culture that I want to flag for you, because it's not hard to do, but you need to know how to do it. And so I have chapters on how to design ethical cultures. A big takeaway is modern behavioral ethics demonstrate how influenced we are by the situation and power structures in which we find ourselves. That means that whole big group in the middle, if we have 7 to 8% engaged in misconduct because that's their predisposition, and they'll do it in online games, and they'll do it in all kinds of other ways and cheat for very small amounts of money. And we have, this is far less studied, but maybe 1 to 2%, even 3% at the other end of the spectrum that are very, very rigid, and they will engage in ethical conduct no matter what. So they're not swayed by social pressure. That means that 10% of the population is locked up between the 7-8% on one side and the 2-3% on the other side. So we are fighting for the 90% in the middle. And the 90% in the middle, by and large, want to be doing ethical things, but they are incredibly influenced by the situation and power structures in which they find themselves. So you could sway them dramatically from one side to another here. The basics work on this has developed since the 1960s in the Milgram experiment. And if no one's talked to you about the Milgram experiment, I hope they do. I make my class at Harvard Business School watch the Milgram experiment videos, and it's an uncomfortable experience. Simply to flag this for you, and I hope you go look this up and see more of it later. The Milgram experiment was following World War II and the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was a big part of the Holocaust. And the question was, why could so many really good people in Germany have gone along with this terrible misconduct, this terrible thing of exterminating 6 million Jews, but then also many other groups and all the damage that it caused? Was it something endemic to the German personality? Was it simply, the culture of conformity in Germany? Was it too much goose stepping? Nobody knew, but Stanley Milgram, who is a psychologist, was really interested in this question because he saw things in the United States that scared him, and he thought seemed to have echoes of this system from Germany. So he created an experiment in which the person in the experiment had to give what they thought were electric shocks to someone who was trying to learn something. And the instructor told the person in the experiment to please give higher and higher doses of the electric shocks, to the point where the person in the experiment thought that they were going to kill the person who was on the other end of the shocks. And it's often a surprise when you talk to students about how many people in these experiments actually administered electric shocks that they thought would kill someone in the experiment when ordered to do so by the experimenter. It's 60 to 67%, and that number has been replicated innumerable times in all kinds of contexts. So it's not education, class, race, religion, national culture. The answer is it's us and our obedience to authority. And that's very scary, because the people who are administering these shocks that they thought were going to kill someone would do it under tremendous duress. They would protest, they would do it, and it's tremendously difficult and uncomfortable to watch the videos of this experiment, but it does tell us we will do terrible things. Really good people do terrible things, especially in response to authority. A second big takeaway: we tend to have unrealistic expectations of the power of rules and other policy guidelines. We know, for example, that we're not supposed to administer electric shocks that are going to kill people. We understand that, but we do it. This is the central issue. We understand what's right. Why aren't we doing it? So, very important that mission statements are actually lived as part of company culture. They can do damage if they're seen as hypocritical. We need the language of ethics to be part of everyday discussions, modeled by supervisors and an accepted part of team discussions. We really are worried about hypocrisy in this area, because unless you have transparency, accountability, and consistency of treatment, you turn people off and they become very cynical, and it's very difficult to get them back on board. You need a speak up culture where people can tell you what's wrong within an organization and not be retaliated against. They need psychological safety to bring up issues and engage. And this issue of no retaliation is incredibly important, but incredibly hard. Over half of employees, and actually this number has gone way up since this data was collected. Now it may be 80 to 90%. It's just skyrocketed. It's very scary to look at this, but but all these employees are being retaliated against for reporting sexual harassment, even if they are observers of the misconduct, which is very disturbing. And then when supervisors look the other direction, the retaliation rates go even higher. So And another very important point is focusing only on outcomes and not processes can even create cheating and other unethical behavior. So if people can't tell you what's actually happening and you're so focused on certain goals, you will actually not get the behavior you want. In fact, you may exacerbate and make the behavior worse. Another big takeaway. We need to be thinking in terms of systems that create behavior and not just liability for the individuals who are put in the places within those systems. So the basic problem is if you don't fix the system, there is something that is pushing people in that system to engage in misconduct. So you may remove and discipline the person in that position right now who is engaging in misconduct. But unless you fix that system and that system of pressures and incentives, the next person in that position will engage in the same misconduct. And that's what we're seeing again and again. We've got to think more in terms of the system and what are the pressures on people to do what they're doing. Another way to say this, and this is from Dr. Trevino, I borrowed it loosely, it's not just bad apples in bad barrels, but you have to think of the management of the orchard. There's something going on that this is happening across the entire orchard. And yes, all of these issues are intimately related to training talent and to retaining talent and diversity and equity inclusion issues. They tend to be felt much more intently by your star performers, by women, by minorities, by those of different sexual orientations. If there is not respect and the ability to speak up in the workforce, you are going to see the people who you're spending so much time and energy recruiting because they're important for the bottom line leave. So that's the book. There are summaries in 4 major areas. Let me give them to you. So there's an overview. There's why behave, more philosophy, science here. Legal information, understanding reporting structures and obligations. What is a company? What can a company tell you to do and not to do? The mechanics, what literally are the types of misconduct that we are seeing in the workplace and what can we do about them? And then thinking in the leadership section about best practices, how to design ethical cultures, and if everything really goes south, how to deal with an investigation and preserve your own reputation. There's also a very important appendix of resources because people really need good objective information in these kinds of situations when things are so precarious around them. And so we wanted to make sure that we included those. And that was a very important vision for the book right from the beginning. To go over what we talked about, this section of the book is how we act versus who we think we are. This section of the book is how many ethical issues manifest. And then this section of the book is thinking about how to design for ethical behavior. So I point you to those sections. And like I said, this is all short questions and answers based on the data and giving you the data in the notes. So this is very easy to digest, process, and just go where you need to go for the answers that you need. So finally, this is the book is less than $20. We did that deliberately. No, the press was not happy with us making them publish a huge book for less than that. But the idea is that this is an easy companion for you to have with you as you deal with these issues. And as we've talked about, this is not the sort of all I learned in kindergarten is what I need to know about ethics. This is a very different world about the behavioral ethics that we're discovering, about the science behind human behavior, about how to create rules so that people will follow them, how to get the behavior that you want and need out of your organization to be able to manage it. Essentially, that's what we're coming back to. You cannot manage your organization unless you manage ethics and think about it like tending a garden, getting back there and doing something about it on a regular basis all the time so that you get what you want growing in the garden, because otherwise something else will grow there. All right.
Excellent, JS. Well, thank you so much for that overview. I can say, having had a chance to read your book, it does live up to its name, what everyone needs to know. So there is something for everyone in this audience to look into. What I'd like to actually do to kind of focus our discussion is to follow up on this metaphor of managing the orchard, right? Now, if I think of the students who come out of Chicago Booth, there are kind of 2 ways connected to this metaphor I think of them. Some of them will be planting an orchard, right? Going through kind of raising the trees, raising the apples. And those are the students who are going to go off and kind of found their own companies. And then a larger group of students will find themselves in the orchard, probably picking fruit, not necessarily managing the orchard itself. So I want to talk a little bit about both groups. Let's talk first about that group of people who actually intend to kind of plant the orchard, the founders of startups. You've talked a little bit about how you design an ethical culture, but are there any tips, tricks, suggestions, concrete suggestions, 2 or 3 you might give to people who want to launch their own business and do so in a way consistent with a strong sense of business ethics to begin with?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important. I've worked with a lot of founders and as a startup attorney for a long time. And one of the things that you really hear from entrepreneurs is, I want to create something in the world. I want to bring some benefit into the world. There's some good or service I want to provide, which is missing out there and would make people's lives better. And in doing so, you have to think about what the place of the company is in the world, right? In order to be able to provide those goods and services, you need to have your company work properly. And you set up, literally, the Supreme Court has told us that companies are people. You're creating a legal person, and you need to think about what kind of legal person that company is going to be in society, and how it's going to contribute and what it means. And I want to flag that I talk to a lot of compliance officers. I talk to a lot of large companies designing compliance, and even they will say, oh my goodness, is this expensive and difficult, and we don't have the resources for it. And that's not what we're talking about at all. In fact, this is absolutely within the reach of a startup, because it's about who we are. It's as simple as saying, these are the things that we do, and these are the things that we don't do. So people get the message very early on when they hand you their first report, and you say, this is not the way we do things. We don't move these numbers into columns that, aren't really reflecting what we're supposed to report. Just go do it again. That's not who we are. And people will very strongly and immediately get the message that that's not how things are done in your company. That's not what's expected of them. And the next report won't have those, or the people will leave. And that's a really important device to say, this is who we are, this is not who we are. And notice it doesn't cost any money. The other thing you can do, even if you're a slightly larger organization, is be very conscious of the stories that you tell about your own organization and the decisions that you reward within the organization. So do you tell a story of someone who went out of their way to get a refund for a customer if it was the right thing to do? That's a very different kind of story, narrative, legend about what's expected in the company and what the company culture is. Then, notice that this person created, a dark pattern that, kept someone from being able to cancel their subscription. Is that who you're celebrating, or are you celebrating very different behavior? It's core to any group of people getting together and describing what is the commonality and the accepted behavior amongst them.
So kind of consistent with the metaphor. So again, there's that group that is planning the orchard and ultimately managing the orchard. But for a lot of our students, they're essentially coming right out of business school. And again, using the metaphor, they're hired to pick fruit. So they're not managing anything. They're not deciding where the trees are planted. If you find your way into a culture that you think is morally problematic, or at least has some significant shortcomings, how much can you hope to change that culture? And how should you ultimately think about that? When should you be trying to aggressively improve upon the management of that orchard? And when do you think you should be looking for the exit?
I think this is an important line for each person. And one of the things I want to do is flag for the whole audience a very good set of resources, which are entirely free, which I think is also really important. Things should be within reach. Good material should be free and accessible. The Giving Voice to Values series, which I affectionately think of as how to speak truth to power without being fired. This is a very, very important set of skills. And so you need to know when you can speak up within an organization, and you need to be able to speak truth to power without getting fired. And you need to make sure that you can say it in such a way that you speak to the common mission and culture and goals of that organization, and make sure that they see that as something that is what we do, right? Getting back to that very, very simple phrase, but it's powerful. even kids at the dinner table. We eat with a knife and fork. This is what we do. This is how we eat dinner, right? And you tell people that and they get that message. In terms of what if you speak truth to power and it either doesn't go that well, which is entirely possible, even if you have done your work to put it in terms of the company's mission and the company's purpose so that they see why this is important to them and why this issue is one that they have to act on. If you are finding that you are simply at an ethical impasse and hate your work and hate where you work and hate what you're being asked to do, then it's very important to leave, because you become a different person over time. We see people whose ethical compasses and values change dramatically in 6 months on the job. There's really great research on this. There's even a set of studies where they looked at people's personal campaign contributions, and they would change to match the rest of the management of the company within 6 months. That's spectacular. Your values change based on the environment that you're in and what's expected of you, and you start to think about who you are differently. And if you don't like that person, that's actually very bad for your personal health. One of the deepest, most hardwired instincts we have is that of disgust. And if you feel disgust when you look at yourself in the mirror every day, your rates of all kinds of terrible, illnesses, cancers, diseases, disabilities goes way, way up, not to mention all the damage that happens to your personal relationships, your family, those you love, all the rest of it. You become a toxic person. And that's very hard to pull yourself back from. So it's, this is really, think about where you work, because it becomes who you are too.
Well, I think kind of consistent with that, and consistent with, again, this idea of being in a management position where you're actually able to kind of manage that orchard of corporate culture and kind of shape the business ethics of that culture. What I want to ask is about kind of some of the difficult choices one occasionally has to make. So the example that I would give is, I always have thought one of the great blessings and joys of being at a place like Chicago Booth is that we bring people from all over the world together under one roof. And any global company has that experience as well, too. And that we all know that insofar as we come from different cultures, there are going to be certain moral codes that inform our behavior, and there will be differences across those codes. You mentioned another in terms of generations, some of the generational expectations of millennials versus Gen Z, to say nothing of getting a little bit older into my generation, Generation X. When you begin having to make those choices across the preferences of different geographic groups or generations, how do you think about that? Or are there ways in which you can kind of overcome those choices? How, if you're managing the orchard of ethics within a company, how do you think about those choices when they're presented to you?
This is a really important conversation, especially when you're talking to compliance officers who have to, say, enforce a rule that is counter to a local culture. I can't give gifts in red envelopes in China or the Far East, because that's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we will have to pay massive damages. So please don't bring that red envelope to that, otherwise socially understood and expected occasion. And so as we're talking to people who have to make this work all the time, there are some key findings that we talk to them about. And a big one is that although the manifestation of behavior can be very different from place to place, it's fascinating how uniform the studies have shown that values are across the world. So when we get to values like fairness, you hear even values like hospitality, generosity, reciprocity, honor, treating people fairly, all of these, you even hear it from small kids. That's not fair. That is really, really rooted in all of us across all cultures. Now, I will say it manifests very differently. So, for example, you'll have people say, oh, well, this is just the 10 Commandments, and, the 10 Commandments are the same everywhere. No, not at all. Thou shalt not kill in one place, thou must kill because it's an honor killing someplace else. So it doesn't manifest the same way, but those values are very much the same. This is about, honor. It's about justice. It's about these other basic values. So a way to explain and get compliance with rules is to go to the values that they represent. So to say something like, it's a very strong value for our company that everybody be treated fairly. And the way that we express that is that we are not going to give special gratuities to anyone, right? And then the light bulb goes off. I understand the value. I understand why you want me to do this. So this is not just creating a rule and expecting me to comply with the rule without understanding what the basis of the rule is. But more than that, you've hooked my value system. And now I'm invested in the rule. And I will tell the person walking out with the bribe, don't bring that bribe. That's not fair. We're a company that believes in fairness, and headquarters will back us up. Don't do this, right? This is not who we are. We are a company that believes in fairness. Now, if you're going to take that approach, you absolutely have to be consistent, and you've got to back your people up, and you've got to, show them that when issues come up, that is really the value that the whole company operates by. Because if you go that route and then you're hypocritical about it because, some people can give bribes and other people can't, that whole system is not going to work. But if you really mean it and you do it, then you can get it to work across an entire company, no matter how many different cultures or parts of it. And you may have to explain the value basis, a little differently. You may have to spend more time on, say, please don't pay bribes in these countries with these social structures and these expectations than in other countries where you have other challenges. But if you can hook it to those basic values and describe them as values of the company as well as of individuals, people understand, and you will get amazing compliance.
Well, that's
amazing
wonderful.
Buy-in.
Well, that's wonderful. And we've got a lot of great questions here. And so I want to kind of continue with this theme of culture. We have one question from a second-year student, Jeff Yao, on this particular question about culture. He says that he's had professors at Chicago Booth like Devin Pope and Nicholas Epley, who've essentially said that the study of culture is kind of a new and an important frontier for the study of behavioral economics more broadly, but it tends to be understudied. And, when we try to kind of make sense of culture, it seems a little bit squishy. So can you give us a sense of to what degree can we rigorously study culture? And for you, what are some of the most important fields of research when thinking about business ethics in terms of the study of not just culture, but cross-cultural differences?
So I think this is a big part of talking to people and having personal relationships with people and that's actually a part of management which has been underemphasized, right? It's not just the study of culture that's underemphasized, but we have to be really careful that we don't over quantify things so that we lose actually what we're measuring. And this is a very important takeaway because there are so many things that we have to manage. I actually worked at the Drucker School for a while, and Peter Drucker is misquoted as saying, what we can't manage, what we can't measure. It's not what he said at all. He never said that. In fact, what he said is you've got to manage a lot of things that you can't measure. And they're things that you can't measure all the time: loyalty, engagement, team cohesiveness, ethics of a company. You probably can't manage those you can't measure those things necessarily, sometimes until they're gone and you have massive misconduct on your hands. So it is really important to actually be out there talking to people. And also because your metrics won't mean anything. Your people will lie to you unless you actually have a connection with them such that they report the metrics that you want them to report. So a big issue sometimes in getting metrics reported is, and this is, you get things all the way from actual misconduct and fraudulent metrics, which we see often because sometimes it's, headquarters is asking us to feed them something, we'll feed them something. This was the Wells Fargo case where, they would put down ridiculously fraudulent emails because they knew that nobody cared, and those would count as opened accounts, and that's what they had to feed, right? They had to meet that standard, so they were going to meet that standard with fraudulent metrics if they needed to. But it shades into other things. Sometimes you get misconduct that people don't realize is misconduct. If they don't understand why you're collecting a specific metric in a specific way, sometimes they're changing the count to quote unquote be helpful to you, right? And sometimes compliance officers will find this and they'll say, but I can't report this to the government agency this way because that's not the standard by which we report. And if you get back to people and you say, look, here's the reason why we want you to do this, here's the value or the principle or the the fundamental understanding that we need to have as a company in order to, you know, engage in this compliance, give us the metrics, whatever it is, then you're much more likely to get metrics that you can use, right? So measure and manage all you want, but if your metrics are no good and your measurements completely off and you're being fed, you know, in some cases, outright fraudulent information, you can't manage your company anyway. You've got to do this stuff. You've got to make sure that you're out there talking to people and they understand what it is. They understand what it is that you're expecting of them in terms of the values underlying things and why you want them to report certain things in certain ways. I will also flag we'll go on to the next question, but I do a lot of work on workplace surveillance, and you can actually create misconduct in the way that you measure. You can create sabotage if you're spending too much time on the metrics and not enough time with the people.
Well, do you think, generally speaking, companies are doing a better job of getting the right kinds of metrics that allow for the type of study that Jeff is talking about, so that we can have kind of a stronger sense of when culture is going right and culture is going wrong? Or, you know, are those efforts kind of running afoul of some of these concerns about surveillance and the ways in which tracking people can sometimes undermine best behavior?
Yeah, it's really hard to study misconduct because you can't necessarily let people know that you're studying their misconduct, because that'll change the very measurement, right? And they'll change the very behavior that you're trying to study. There are major problems with measurement in this area, and there are major problems with all kinds of other ways of collecting metrics. Now, there are brilliant researchers and brilliant people out there looking at things, but it's also really important to be aware of this dance between what you're collecting and how you're collecting it and how that's experienced by the people from whom you're collecting it. I would also, I mean, this is a little bit of a different box, but it's really important to flag for people. Just because you can collect data doesn't mean, first of all, that it will tell you what you think it's going to tell you. Second of all, that you want the data. And this is a very important point. And this is something that people are not talking about, but they really need to, especially as the law becomes more unsettled around a lot of basic issues. And I'm thinking specifically around abortion right now with the Dobbs decision. Companies that collect biometric data on their employees such that you can figure out fertility cycles, and with a Fitbit you can figure out a woman's fertility cycle and her geolocation. You could be subpoenaed for that information in a prosecution or for other legal proceedings. So you may not want this information at all. There just may be times in which you do not want to collect this data. You do not want to have possession of this data. You do not want, for all kinds of reasons, for anyone to be collecting this. And certainly for your, should your employees find out that you have that kind of data, you will lose your connection with your employees entirely, especially large parts of your workforce. So there's really far more that needs to be talked about in the ethics of how you measure, what you measure, and the effect of that measurement. And then thinking about whether, especially for liability purposes, you want to be holding on to that, because you're looking at a class action lawsuit for release of the data, and you're also presumptively going to be sued, not, asked for it by the government, but then also in a class action suit by employees who are then going to challenge why you even have that data, and that would be the basis of a pregnancy discrimination suit and other discrete suits. So it's a minefield. you really need to be thinking strategically, not just as an engineer about, can I do this? But with your whole risk management team, including your lawyers and your ethicists, about whether we should be doing this.
Well, I want to kind of combine two questions that really take up this broader idea of managing the orchard of corporate culture, one from Irena Kaplan and the other from Brian Hughes. So Irena asks, why does it seem often to be the case that there are companies that go to such great lengths to not just defend the bad apples, but the structures, right, that allow for those bad apples to begin with, notwithstanding the fact that they talk about having a strong, positive corporate culture? So why do you think that is often the case? And Brian asks, kind of connected to that in certain respects, are there good examples that we can maybe look at of companies that are managing their orchard well, and that are doing a good job of getting rid of those bad apples and making sure that their actions and their words match up?
Yes, yes, and yes. I will answer this a little bit more quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for everyone's questions. But in terms of why is it that the first set of the questions was, why is it that companies seem to defend people who engage in such poor conduct and or keep the incentive systems that created the conduct? Let me start there. And then the second is, best practices, who's out there doing great things. And we'll definitely get there. It's a very important phenomenon. And this is something that needs to be said more often, that people who engage in misconduct, it's often personal misconduct that bleeds into business misconduct, and or there's often a relationship there. And it's important to understand that when somebody is a, say, star performer and they've engaged in this kind of misconduct, this is, very much been across the headlines with the Me Too movement and with other really so-called star performers or star presenters or other people who engage in terrible personal misconduct along these lines, but also, bullying, harassment, racial discrimination, all kinds of ways in which there can be really bad behavior by star performers. Often what you've seen is you're seeing someone who is hollowing out the area around them so that they can't be challenged by anyone else who has good ideas, can do a good job, so that they're the only anchor that you could have for the show, right? Because they've driven out everybody around them. And so it turns out that this is a terrible loss to the company in terms of talent. If you've driven out all of those talented, people who could have innovated, who could have given you other possibilities, then it's really a huge loss to the company. And that one person who is there trying to make themselves look great, they're doing this deliberately to be your only option. So there's been a lot of studies of star performers and the payouts to protect star performers, and they end up costing you enormous amounts of money, way more than they are worth, and you end up cutting ties with them at some point anyway, when it just becomes too damaging for the company. And there's a really important lesson in there too, which is that this personal misconduct is actually stealing from the company. It's stealing from the company in lots of different ways. It's stealing from the company in driving out other talent, other innovation, other resources, other, people who could be your future stars. If you're looking at why there aren't women and, people with diverse backgrounds in your pipeline, and you see them leaving underneath a certain manager, go look into that and go fix that and maybe fire that manager if that's what's going on, because there's some bullying or something else happening there where this person is not a good manager and not able to keep star talent and develop star talent, which is in the company's interest. But also, they're stealing in the sense of these people are cloaking themselves with the authority of the company to abuse others, right? They're using their very position, the position that you have given them inside this company, to harass other people, to engage in this misconduct, to drive out of, that is an abuse of the authority that you have given them. They are stealing and literally using the cloak of the authority of the company for misconduct. And so that is a very important, that is a threat to your ability to control the company. It's a threat to your ability to control all kinds of things. And you really need to see that as a direct challenge and affront to the organization and stealing from the organization. So that's a whole discussion of star performers and why people get away with things. But it really, there needs to be a complete change of understanding about what that is. Those are your bad apples who are taking. Yeah.
And do you think, for people who want to dig into this more, are there any companies that you often refer your students to who you think do a good job of this work that we can maybe learn from or even take inspiration from?
Yeah. And now you have to be very careful in business ethics that you don't keep talking about companies and then the very next day they're splashed across the headlines because they've sort of pumped themselves up too much. But you're looking for companies that are slow, that are steady, that say what they do and do what they say. Costco is a good example of that. Hershey's is actually really interesting example. A company that's turned itself around and has very interesting leadership right now is Lockheed Martin in the defense sector, because they got into so much trouble, and they decided they didn't want to be that company. They wanted to be a different company, and their defense contracts were on the line. So all of a sudden they had to be a different company. It's fascinating. You can turn this around. And initially at the beginning, it's going to be a little harder because people are scared to trust you. You said that you were an ethical company before, but yet you engaged in all these things or protected the people who did engage in these things when and allowed them to retaliate against the people who reported the misconduct, right? It's very insidious. So when you first get new leadership and you say, no, now we mean it. Now we really want to be an ethical company, and we are going to act on complaints, and we are going to protect the people who do blow the whistle in these situations. By the way, those people are your gold, right? Like the people who will actually tell you what's going on, who will actually report things, treat them like kings and queens and beyond, right? Like that is so important. They took a massive risk to do that. And the statistics are that they just really don't make this up. 2-3% make it up the most. And it's often there's something really rotten at the heart there that you need to go investigate anyway, right? People do not, by and large, go out on a limb and do something that is this scary, frankly. If they're not really living in terrible conditions that they need to report, and they're asking for help, and this is your chance to find out what's actually happening. These are your metrics. These are this is your real feedback. This is how you can manage your company and find out what's really going on. So engage with those people, use them, like find out everything you can from them, right? And go send and probe and take it seriously and do the investigation and nip this in the bud before people accumulate power and become untouchable. So there are lots of companies that do this. The rates of reporting actually go up initially, but then they go way down because you're on top of it. And eventually this becomes a very good company to manage because you're not putting out fires all the time. You're not terrified that it's permeated the entire organization and now you can't trust any of your metrics, right? These are the companies you want to be running because they tell you the truth. They're engaged, they're in the company and its business and its product, and they give you their innovations, and they'll be excited about committing to the company. If you're asking them to work extra time and work hard on behalf of something they actually believe in, you're much more likely to get the response that you want and get that all hands on deck and commitment from your people. And that's a marvelous company because now you have a competitive advantage to do all kinds of things that other people can't.
Well, we have a lot of great questions here, and unfortunately we're running a little short on time, though I will say that it's one good reason to pick up the book because you can answer those questions in Professor Nelson's book. But I do want to conclude with one question from Chris Marty, which I think is an important one, particularly for the students who are joining us. Can you give folks a sense of how, if you're looking at a potential employer, how do you evaluate how well that orchard is being managed when you're on the outside? Any suggestions you might make to help people to make good decisions about the organizations they're going to join, especially if they're currently in business school and looking ahead to employment beyond business school?
This is a really important question. Yes, you want to find out what the culture is inside the organization and whether you can believe what they say. right? People, we are very social animals. We really sniff out hypocrisy, right? And if you start talking to people, other people in the team, other people around that team, and they say, oh, that person, they say all the right things, but they don't actually follow through. They don't do what they say they're going to do. Look at the turnover rates. Is there an opening because nobody stays longer than 6 months? They're all transferring out. They're getting, they're running for the exits. There's probably a toxic manager in that, or, some kind of something going on that this is not healthy. Start asking those kinds of questions. Look for actual instances of where the company has acted. Has the company fired people on this basis? And important people, that is, boy, do people start talking about that. If you want to get somebody's attention inside your organization, then, take it seriously and discipline somebody, at the top of the organization or all throughout the organization. Be consistent. Is that that consistency, transparency, and accountability that you're asking about? Do the people inside the organization trust the organization to, protect them if something happens, and or to actually affirmatively act to find out whether there's misconduct? But beyond that, do people feel good working there? I mean, there's a baseline floor of compliance and, not engaging in misconduct, and please don't harass or, assault or what, discriminate against people. But more than that, do people like working there? Would they take that job again? Would they, are they planning to stay there? If they tell you I'm running for the exits, I'm trying to get out, maybe they won't be that frank, but, ask them what they want to do in a year or 5 years. And if it's, I want to be at this company and I love it, that's a very different answer than, oh, I've always had a sideline business. Listen to what people are actually telling you about the experience of working there. And it's very important to understand that institutions are not just the name across the door. Institutions are people, and institutions feel very different inside based on who's there and what the values are of the organization and what they understand is the common culture that brings them together.
Well, J.S. Nelson, the book is Business Ethics, What Everyone Needs to Know. Thank you so much for joining us with our institution, Chicago booth, and thank you to the Stigler Center for putting together this conversation.
Thank you. My great pleasure to be here.